Okay, well, thank you very much, Barry, for inviting me. I did speak here a couple of years ago in this program, and very much enjoyed that. And it continues to be a wonderful program. Some people I spoke with last week had been here a couple of years ago, and so it's good to be back and discussing these topics. And as a philosopher, I must say, I especially appreciate whether we're ethereal or not, being invited, because I think as Ron was suggesting, and this is a point often lost, all of these public policy issues, whether about justice or other things, involve values. And so there's really no way to arrive at reasonable judgments about public policy without having value commitments. And those commitments need to be, as Ron suggested, as rigorously examined as the empirical information that's also essential for public policy. So it's good to be here to talk a little bit about the sort of value side of policymaking. Although I must say I feel a little bad because I may end up today raising more questions than giving answers. And I could give you a justification for that, but maybe I should just get to the business. Okay, so here's this perhaps silly question that I posed for myself and for you, was I was supposed to talk about the nature of justice. And I started to think about, and as you'll see, I've come to the conclusion there actually are different types of justice. I don't only mean justice applying to different areas like economic justice, criminal justice, environmental justice, but there are actually maybe different justices, different concepts, different ideals that we apply in talking about whether things are just or unjust, and that actually complicates things. So I'll apologize in advance for perhaps even at the end, after trying to explain some things, leaving you feeling more muddled than maybe when you came. Okay, I want to start with a quote from John Rawls. Ron said John Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice, 1971, really a major work which transformed discussions of many of these issues, not only among academic philosophers, but also people in law schools, people in economics, people in many areas. So it's a very powerful book. If you don't want to read all 700 pages, I have a short chapter, about 10 pages maybe, in a book of mine on economic justice that would save you a little time for novels and other entertainment, or drinking soda, for example. So here's a quote from the very beginning, very early in Rawls' book. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant, must be rejected or revised if it is untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well-arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. So you can see that Rawls takes justice very seriously. And he seems to think, and I'll talk a bit more about this, that justice is a kind of unitary something or other. And so if our task today was to sort of figure out what is the unitary thing that justice is, then in a way I'll disappoint you, but I hope that I can illuminate some things and take a stance a bit different from Rawls's. And in thinking about what to say, I looked back at the course description that's online for this course, and I was kind of intrigued by the way that justice appeared in this. So the course description, the title is sort of Justice, What is Right and Why? And then this notion that we're going to have a multidisciplinary exploration of justice in all these different areas. And then the class will delve into a range of topics, all of which turn on the question, what is the right thing to do? And one of the things that struck me, being a philosopher, being very attuned to language and so on, is that in reaching the question, we've heard this, those of us who were here last week, Michael Sandel, what is the right thing to do? That if the key question is what is the right thing to do, that seems to be different from the question, what is the just thing to do? So there's been sort of a slide from justice to right. And then that raises an interesting question about, well, how do those two things relate to one another? And there's a standard view that morality or rightness is actually a more general concept, and that justice issues are kind of a sub-part of morality. Not every moral issue is an issue of justice. So justice is sort of a subset. And then below here, this is the end of the statement, there was a comment here about the meaning of justice and contrasting views as to the basis for ethical behavior. Maximizing welfare, the utilitarian view, individual rights, maybe a libertarian view, virtue, and the good life, which Ron didn't talk about, although Ron is the author of a book on a virtue theory approach to environmental issues. So that suggests that there are these other really important values. So there is kind of a question here about what's the relationship. If we're going to ask about the role of, say, values in public policy, are all of the things we're going to be concerned with matters of justice, or are there other kinds of values? And that, I'm not going to really answer that, but I find that sort of interesting that it's very easy to slide from starting to talk about one thing, justice, and then moving to other concepts. And it's possible that these different concepts will actually lead us in different directions. So here are some key questions I want to talk a little bit about tonight. Is justice unitary? Is there a single thing that is justice? Or are there multiple forms of justice, i.e. justices? And if there are multiple forms, are they compatible with one another? Or do they conflict with one another? Can something be just A and unjust B, or just B and unjust A? How's that going to work? What should we do? How should we think about things if forms of justice conflict with one another? And then a final question, if there are these other values, is justice always primary? Or if there are conflicts, do some of these other non-justice values for welfare, rights, virtue, and so on, take priority over justice? And if they do, then Rawls's original statement that if let me go back to it. How do I do that? Right, that's the wrong way. Oh, okay, great. So this idea that laws and institutions must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. But what if there are other important values and that some institutions come out okay from the perspective of these other things, but not okay from the perspective of justice? Then where do we stand? Do we automatically reform or abolish these institutions, or is it the case that maybe we give lower status to justice? So I raised those as questions. Okay, so one, having blurred things a bit perhaps, let me try to at least clarify a part of the set of problems here. I want to make a distinction between two types of justice, because they will pop up in a lot of the issues that are going to be spoken about in the weeks to come, and that I will talk about not only today but next week. So I want to start off by saying something about procedural justice. So procedural justice is the idea that there's a set of rules for an activity, and whenever the rules are properly followed, the result is just. An example that I give here, a person is treated justly by the legal system if he or she has a fair trial, So the requirement of fair trial is the requirement of justice, procedural justice. A person is treated unjustly if he or she does not have a fair trial. Right? So those would be an injustice. And I don't have to feed you examples or things of what things might make trials unjust. A second concept is somewhat different. Instead of looking at the procedure, you look at the outcome. So what I'm going to call here outcome justice. And the concept here is that some outcomes are inherently just, that is, in and of themselves. They are intrinsically just or intrinsically unjust. And justice is achieved when there is a just outcome. For example, a person is treated justly if the outcome of a trial is correct. That is, if a person who is factually guilty, they did it, they committed the crime, receives a verdict of guilt. And if a factually innocent person receives a verdict of innocence. So those would be the right outcomes. So we have these two types of justice, and then the question of, well, how do we evaluate cases in which they clash, that is, in which just procedures lead to unjust outcomes. A person has a fair trial, right? There are no information withheld. They have a lawyer who's competent. They can, the people making accusations can be cross-examined, whatever we think. And of course, that's a big job in itself. It translates the notion of a fair trial into actual procedures, right? But let's assume that went well. So procedurally just, but lo and behold, the innocent person gets convicted. What do we say about these? We could say, hey, look, you had a fair trial. Sorry, you got through it. But you had a fair trial, period. Or what I think maybe most of us would think is, ooh, you may have been procedurally fair, but gee whiz, you're being punished for things you didn't do. So we have here then two notions of justice, two concepts, and they can be used in different contexts. And then again, we have problems because there are competing justices, right? Not justice versus something else, but justice versus justice. So I want to say a little bit about Robert Nozick's theory that Ron mentioned, this libertarian theory, which Nozick called the entitlement theory. And this is sort of cutting down, leaving out some things, but the basic idea is that a person is entitled to, that is justifiably owns or has a just claim to something, if first he or she acquired it from nature. There's, you go down the beach, there's all these rocks or shells. They're not owned by anybody. You pick them up, you take them, put them in your collection, and they're yours, right? So you acquired something unowned from nature. Nobody else was involved. So that he called that acquisition, actually, is one way of getting a just claim on something. And the other is through a voluntary exchange, or it doesn't have to be an exchange because it can be a gift. I give you a present or whatever. I don't get something back, but or I could sell it to you. And both of those, the key feature about them is that they're voluntary. And so from Nozick's perspective, if you were going to say what was kind of just about the possession of things, it would all rest on these two principles. So the pure procedural view, what I'm calling here, is that if a person acquires things through one of these procedures, as acquisition from nature or voluntary giving or trading, then that the outcome is just because what determines the justice of the outcome is simply the procedure. Right? So if you want to know, is it just or not that you or I have something, then Nozick called his view a historical view. You have to find out, how did it come about? If it came about because I took it, or you took it from nature, or we traded it, or I gave it to you as a gift, or you gift, to me is a gift, then it's fine, and that's just. And a just society would be, in a certain way, just the combination of all these individual acts of acquisition and trading. Right? So a perfectly just society would be one in which everything that everybody owned came about through these processes. Right? So the process, the procedures, provide the criterion for judging what is a just distribution, period. Outcomes and features of outcomes are irrelevant. So if it turns out that this very nice set of procedures, acquisitions from nature, transfers, gifts, and so on, leads to a situation in which, let's say, just picking numbers from a hat, at the top, a 1% has great, extraordinary levels of wealth, and 99% of people are poverty-stricken. It would still be just if it came about through voluntary acquisition and transfers. Okay, so this is a procedural view, right? So you might say that the procedure wags the tail here, right? So the outcome just is determined, the criterion for the outcome, and its justice has to do with the procedure. That's a very important view. Next week I will talk more about this. But let's just get a contrast here with respect to theories, or not really theories, but criteria of economic justice. So here's just 3 examples. They won't be, 2 of them at any rate, won't be strange to you, of outcome-based views of economic justice. One would be a pure egalitarian view. Somebody who really believes in economic equality. Very few people do, but and basically a just distribution would be one in which each person in the relevant society or group has an equal share of whatever the stuff is. Unequal distributions are unjust. It's interesting, there's a lot of talk about equality and inequality these days, but I'd say virtually nobody means this kind of equality. And I wonder what they do mean, actually. But, okay, so that would be one outcome, right? And it'd be very easy to tell. One of the nice things about this criterion is that if you thought this was the proper criterion of justice, you would know more or less immediately by looking at or finding out what things people had or how things were distributed. You know, you could go to the Census Bureau or to the Congressional Budget Office, some places, and find all sorts of numbers. You could say, gee, does it turn out that everybody has equal stuff? And you'd find out that the answer is no. So on that view, these would be unjust distributions. A second one is a proposal that justice requires a floor on the possession of resources. That is a minimum level that everybody would have. So a just distribution would be one in which everyone has the resources, let's say, required to meet basic needs. So you might look over a society and you'd say, oh gosh, there's a lot of inequality here, but actually inequality doesn't matter. What matters is that some people don't have the resources for meeting basic needs. So a just society would be one in which everybody had at least those. You'd have a floor on income, and then you wouldn't have a ceiling because you wouldn't care, from the point of view of this criterion of justice, you wouldn't care that some people had more than other people or that some people had a lot more than other people. The only relevant factor would be, is everybody at the level, at the floor, where they have the resources to meet basic needs? And then finally, Rawls' difference principle, which basically is an attempt to set a ceiling on wealth and income, but does it in kind of an ingenious way by invoking a floor. So let's see if I can quickly say what this is. So for Rawls, a just distribution is one in which the degree of inequality between the best off and the worst off is set at the level that maximizes the well-being of the least well-off people. So the idea here is you could start with, and he talks about this at some length, you could start with equality, but then you might say, well, do we really need to have everybody have equal shares? What if it turned out that by allowing some inequalities, everybody benefited? The pie is bigger, everybody ends up higher, right? So everybody's down at this level, and now somebody's way up here, but everybody else has risen above that. So Rawls is saying that it's okay to have some disparities, some inequalities, but then he answers the question, well, how big can those disparities be? By saying that there's a limit on the ceiling, on the amount that the most wealthy people will have, because the disparity is only just if its existence brings the people at the bottom up as high as possible. So that if, for example, an egalitarian came along and said, no, that's terrible, there's such a big gap, and all this sort of thing, Rawls would say, well, let's ask what would happen. Suppose that you lower the level of the best off, and the result was that the worst off actually went down. Well, that would be stupid, and justice wouldn't require it, right? So the idea is that justice is achieved when you have this relationship between the floor and the ceiling. Okay, so all right, so what are we going to do? We've got these two kinds of criteria, procedural ones, outcome-based ones, and we have some choices. We could accept one, say the procedural criterion, and reject the outcome-based one. That's what Nozick does, actually. It's got a pure procedural view. All he cares about the procedure, doesn't care about the results. Or you could have an outcome-based criterion and reject a procedural one. So, for example, an egalitarian, or maybe even a utilitarian, who wants just to maximize well-being, might not care about how you do that, but only cares about achieving the goal. Or the egalitarian might say, hey, look, we'll do what it takes. Right? So all they care about is the outcome. Or you could say, wait a minute, and so this is my view, both of these forms of justice are really important, but they do sometimes conflict with one another, and that creates problems for us. We have to then figure out what takes priority, and so we have some real difficulties. But I'd say, so the simple moral of the story, the one that I think is relatively clear and plausible, is that there's no single kind of justice. There are different forms of justice and not a single unitary form in the way that Rawls' statement that I quoted suggests. And that's what I meant by what are justices. It wasn't a typo. I want to give you one other example just very quickly about these kind of conflicts, so just to realize that they occur. So the Declaration of Independence is probably one of the best known bits of language for people in the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, I want to suggest that what we see here is actually a clash between an outcome theory, were rights respected, right? So do we have a society in which this outcome of respecting rights occurs or not? And then this other procedural criterion that actions or policies are just if they receive the consent of the governed, right? So elections, votings, whatever. So if enough people vote for slavery or some other thing like that, well, It may violate unalienable rights, but it might satisfy the consent criterion, and maybe you think the consent criterion is more important than the rights criterion, so there we go. Another complication that's, I think, very interesting and very, very relevant, Ron sort of touched on this. In the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, probably a lot of you know this line, it says toward the end, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it came to me several years ago that although this is stated in a kind of negative kind of sense, no person shall be deprived without due process of law, that actually what it really means is that people may be deprived of life, liberty, or property with due process of law. In other words, there's a permission built into this. It's not simply a prohibition. And that's really important because, again, people often talk about rights, another important concept, as if they were always inviolable and absolute, and there are very few rights that are absolute. Certainly not life, liberty, and property, as stated here. Okay, I'm going to finish up with two sets of questions. I apologize for now throwing a whole lot of things at you to think about and that I don't know the answers to, but these are really important questions, and maybe the meetings in the future will help to answer them. So first of all, this is the ethereal part, challenges to justice in theory. If procedural and outcome justice conflict, how can we decide which takes priority, either generally or in a specific case? Is there a higher level idea of justice to appeal to, right? There could be a hierarchy. You could say, oh, well, actually, outcome justice is more important than procedural or vice versa, or maybe there's justice 3, which if you or I could formulate would be the one that would help us to decide when the others conflict, whatever. Is there a higher level of justice to appeal to? Or must we appeal to another moral value, like rights, virtue, or well-being? And if we need to appeal to something higher, does that show that justice is less fundamental than Rawls claimed? Okay. These are real questions, they're not rhetorical questions. And then finally, challenges to justice in practice. Is the criminal justice system morally justified and just in some sense if it makes people safer overall, even though some people are just unjustly convicted of crimes? Or I might say unjustly punished in that they have punishments that are too strong, too severe for what they've done. Are those things okay if the system makes most people safer? Which would be better, a just society that conforms to your own criterion of economic justice, whichever that might be, or an unjust society in which more people were better off than in your favorite form of a just society? And then finally, and this was really triggered by Kevin's remarks last week at the end, I thought very powerful. How much do we actually care about justice? What if economic justice for all people in the United States required greatly diminished resources available to you, to me, our spouses, our children, our grandchildren, and our dearest friends? Would you and I actually vote in favor of a just society?